She was sitting so still that the first responders almost missed her entirely. 8 years old, soaking wet. Alone beside a guardrail on a highway that had no business being this empty on a Thursday night. No crying, no screaming for her mother. Just those eyes, wide and dark and absolutely hollow, staring out at nothing like whatever had been living behind them had simply left. The wreckage was 40 feet ahead. 2 vehicles. One of them folded in half against a concrete barrier. Rain still falling in sheets. Emergency lights painting everything red and blue and red again. Paramedics moving fast, police talking into radios. And this little girl sitting in the wet grass, holding a broken watch in both hands like it was the only thing left in the world that still made sense. Vince Calloway saw her before anyone else did. He saw her because he'd spent 22 years learning how to spot the people that the room had already forgotten. Before we go any further, if this story already has you leaning in, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. People are joining us from all over. And if you stay until the very end of this one, I promise you it will be worth every single minute. This is The Girl with No Name, and it starts right here. The charity ride had ended 3 hours ago in the parking lot of a VFW hall outside of Denton, where they'd raised enough money to cover 6 months of mortgage payments for a widow named Carol Hutchins, whose husband had come home from overseas in a flag-draped box 2 years prior. Vince had shaken hands, drunk 2 cups of bad coffee, declined the whiskey twice, and then pointed his bike north toward home because the kind of tired he was carrying wasn't the kind that drinks itself away. He was 61 miles into the ride when the rain started. Not gradually. That was the thing about weather on these roads. It didn't build up to anything, didn't give you a sporting chance. 1 minute the sky was just dark and overcast, the way it had been all evening, and then suddenly the water was coming down sideways, drumming against his helmet, turning the asphalt black and reflective and treacherous in a span of about 15 seconds. Vince eased off the throttle and dropped his speed. The headlight of his bike swept across the wet road in a long yellow arc. He knew these stretches of highway the way other men knew the faces of their children. Every curve, every rise in the grade, every place where the shoulder dropped off too quickly into gravel and loose earth. He'd ridden them in heat and in snow, and in the kind of flat gray despair that settles over a man when he has nowhere else to go. He knew them, which was why he noticed, almost a quarter mile out, that the emergency lights ahead weren't moving the way they should have been. 2 vehicles. One of them, a state trooper's cruiser, parked at a diagonal across the right lane with its light bar going. The other was an ambulance, backed up close to something Vince couldn't quite make out yet through the rain in the distance. He slowed further, eased to the shoulder, killed his speed to almost nothing as he approached the outer edge of the scene. A crash. Recent. The air still tasted like burnt rubber and something metallic and wrong. A sedan had gone through the guardrail on the right side and struck the concrete barrier head-on. The front end was compressed into something that no longer resembled the front end of any vehicle Vince had ever seen. The driver's door had been forced open from the outside. A tarp covered something in the grass 15 feet away, and even from here, even in the rain, even after everything Vince Calloway had seen in his life, the shape beneath that tarp made his jaw tighten. He pulled his bike fully onto the shoulder and cut the engine. A trooper was already walking toward him, hand raised. Young, maybe 28, the kind of young where authority still sits awkwardly on a person's shoulders, like a jacket that hasn't been broken in yet. "Sir, you're going to need to keep moving. Road's restricted right now." "I know," Vince said. He pulled off his helmet and let the rain hit his face. "I just want to make sure I'm not in anyone's way." The trooper looked at him the way people always looked at Vince when they first saw him up close. The width of his shoulders, the gray stubble, the network of old scars along his left jawline that no story he ever told about them was entirely true. The cut of his riding jacket, the patches. "You need to move along," the trooper said again, but with slightly less certainty. Vince wasn't listening anymore. He was looking past the trooper's left shoulder, past the ambulance, past the knot of first responders gathered around the crumpled sedan. He was looking at the guardrail 20 feet beyond all of it, at the patchy grass and gravel on the other side of it, at the small shape sitting in the wet dark that every single person on this scene had apparently decided did not exist. "There's a kid over there," Vince said. The trooper turned. Looked. Looked harder. What? Sitting by the rail, right side, about 20 feet past your ambulance. Vince was already moving, swinging his leg off the bike, boots hitting the wet asphalt. She's been sitting there the whole time I've been watching. He didn't wait for permission. He walked past the trooper and past the ambulance and past two paramedics who looked up and started to say something and then stopped when they followed his eye line and finally saw what he was already moving toward. He heard the trooper calling behind him for the others. He didn't look back. The girl was 8 years old, maybe. Small, soaking wet from the rain and from something else. Her clothes were wet differently on one side, the kind of wet that comes from lying in grass or from a car interior flooding, or from something Vince chose not to examine too closely yet. She was holding a wristwatch in both hands, cradling it against her chest like a small wounded animal. The crystal was cracked. One of the hands was broken off entirely. She didn't look up when he approached. She was staring at the middle distance, not at the crash scene, not at the road, not at anything Vince could identify. Just out, into the dark and the rain, and the space where something used to be. He slowed his walk about 10 feet out, dropped his approach angle, making himself smaller, non-threatening. He'd learned that from a search and rescue volunteer he'd known in another life. You come in low and slow, you don't loom, you don't project anything loud. You just make yourself available. He crouched down about 4 feet away from her. She still didn't look at him. "Hey," he said. Quiet, just loud enough to clear the sound of the rain. "Nothing." "I see you sitting there." He kept his voice flat, even, not warm in the performed way, not gentle in the way that people use when they're trying too hard. "Just present. You don't have to look at me. You don't have to say anything. I'm just going to be right here for a minute." A few seconds passed. The rain fell. Somewhere behind them, radios crackled and voices picked up urgency as the first responders finally processed what they'd missed. The girl's eyes moved, just slightly. They tracked toward him without her head turning. A slow, sideways shift of attention, like an animal that wants to assess a thing without committing to acknowledging it. "I'm not going anywhere," Vince said. "Not until you're okay." Her fingers tightened slightly around the broken watch. He looked at it, looked at her, made a decision. "That watch is pretty banged up," he said. Casual, matter of fact, like they were having a conversation in the middle of a normal evening. "Looks like it took a hard hit, but it's not done. I've seen worse come back." Something shifted in her face, so small that anyone else would have missed it. The faintest tightening around her eyes, not quite a frown, but the beginning of attention, the beginning of being somewhere instead of nowhere. "I know someone who might be able to fix it," Vince said. "If you want." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And Vince had been looked at by a lot of people over a lot of years, and he'd learned to read what lived behind eyes the way some people read weather, and what he saw in this little girl's eyes in that moment, in the middle of the rain and the red and blue emergency lights and the smell of burnt metal, was something that hit him somewhere behind his sternum with a force that surprised him. It wasn't fear. It was the particular kind of loss that comes after fear has exhausted itself. The kind of loss where a person has been so completely separated from every familiar thing that they stop expecting any of it to come back. He'd seen it in the mirror once, a long time ago. "I'm right here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The paramedics reached them about 40 seconds later. One of them, a woman with dark hair pulled back tight and efficient hands that checked the girl's pulse and pupil response without a second of hesitation, looked at Vince over the child's head with an expression that was partly professional assessment and partly something else. "You know her?" she asked. "No," Vince said. "You family?" "No." "Then I'm going to need you to step back, sir." Vince stood, didn't step back, stayed close enough that the girl could still see him if she turned her head, because she'd turned her head toward him, and something in her body language had shifted in a way that the paramedic probably hadn't clocked, but that Vince absolutely had. The girl's shoulders had dropped a quarter inch. The death grip on the broken watch had loosened by the smallest degree. She needed to still be able to see him. He stayed. They worked around him. The trooper came over and asked his name, and he gave it. Gave his license too, gave his club affiliation. Gave every piece of information they asked for without friction, because friction right now cost time, and he understood that. Another paramedic was running a secondary assessment. The young trooper was on his radio, talking fast. Does she know what happened? Vince asked the dark-haired paramedic. She hasn't spoken, the paramedic said. She was wrapping the girl's wrist, a cut, not deep, but the kind that had been bleeding for a while. Not a word. We can't get a name. We can't get anything. She's in shock. She's in more than shock, Vince said. The paramedic looked at him again. This time, the professional assessment in her expression had a different quality to it. What makes you say that? He didn't answer right away. Watched the girl's face. Watched the way her eyes tracked the emergency lights without really seeing them, the way they drift and then refocus, like a compass needle that kept losing north. She doesn't know where she is, he said finally, but I don't think that's the scariest part for her. I think she doesn't know who she is. Silence between them for a beat. The rain. We're going to transport her to St. Anthony's, the paramedic said quietly. There's a children's crisis unit. Who goes with her? We'll notify Child Protective Services. They'll send someone. Vince looked at the girl. She was still watching him. How long does that take? He asked. The paramedic hesitated long enough that she'd already answered him without saying anything. Sir, St. Anthony's Medical Center sat at the edge of Millhaven like a thing the city had pushed to the margins, big enough to be functional, underfunded enough to be perpetually overwhelmed. The children's crisis unit was on the third floor, and it smelled like industrial cleaner and stale vending machine coffee and the particular brand of institutional exhaustion that accumulates in places where people bring problems that society doesn't have good answers for. Vince sat in a plastic chair outside the unit's main door for 4 hours. He bought bad coffee from the machine down the hall, drank it standing because the chair was uncomfortable in a way that suggested it had been designed to discourage long visits. He walked the length of the hall twice, slowly, working out the stiffness from the ride, and then came back and sat again. A social worker showed up at the 90-minute mark. Young, overstretched, carrying a tablet computer and the specific brand of apology that gets built into people who do necessary work with insufficient resources. Her name was Delgado, according to her lanyard, and she spoke to Vince for about 3 minutes before explaining that she was covering 4 cases tonight and she'd do everything she could, but that he should understand the process. Vince understood the process. He'd watched the process before. Is there family? He asked. Nothing in the vehicle registration for this road, she said. The car was registered to a James Allen Brooks, address in Kentucky. We've been trying to reach next of kin. Any luck? Something moved across her face, something careful. We're still working on it. He understood that too. And the girl? No ID. Nothing in the vehicle that helps us identify her. She still hasn't spoken, but Delgado glanced at the door to the unit. The physician on call thinks she may be experiencing dissociative amnesia, trauma-induced. It can come and go, and sometimes it... She stopped herself, started again. We're going to need to find family. And if you don't, Vince asked, then we place her temporarily in foster care while the investigation continues. The words sat in the air between them with the particular weight of things that are said with the best intentions and accomplish very little. She's going to be moved around, Vince said. She's going to be moved around, he said again. Not accusing, just naming it. Delgado looked at him for a moment. In her eyes was the exhaustion of someone who has stopped being surprised by how often the system answers legitimate crises with a phone tree and a waiting period. Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Calloway? He thought about the girl's eyes, the way her fingers had loosened on that broken watch when he'd stayed. I need to know what she needs, he said. Practically. Tonight and going forward. If there's no family found in the next 24 hours, what does she need? Delgado blinked. That's a complicated question. Then let's start with the easy parts. On. The conversation that followed took another 40 minutes and covered ground that Vince suspected Delgado hadn't expected to cover with a 62-year-old biker she'd met in a hallway. He asked about emergency placement qualifications, about the county's requirements, about what the process looked like for temporary custody when no family was immediately available. He asked about the girl's medical status, about whether she'd be kept overnight or longer, about who would be assigned to her case, and what the continuity of that assignment looked like. Delgado answered him with increasing directness as she realized he wasn't asking out of curiosity. When he finally stood up to leave, she said, "Mr. Calloway, you understand that even if you were to pursue emergency placement, the process involves home visits, background checks. It takes time." "I know," he said. "You have a record. Minor charges, but they're there." "I know that too." "So you understand it might not—" "I understand that the process takes time," he said, "and that time costs her something. So I'm going to start the process, and I'm going to hope the time is short." He pulled on his jacket. "Can I see her before I go?" Delgado studied him for a moment that lasted longer than professional assessment usually did. Then she opened the door. The room was small and soft-lit. A hospital bed sized for children, the rails up. The girl was lying on top of the covers, still in the hospital gown someone had changed her into, still holding the broken watch. Someone had cleaned her up, combed her wet hair back from her face, put non-slip socks on her feet. She looked smaller than she had on the highway. Kids always do, in hospital beds. Her eyes were open, tracking the ceiling. Vince stepped inside and stood by the door. Didn't approach, just let himself be visible, the way he had at the guardrail, at the same measured distance that said, "I'm here," without saying anything about expectation. Her eyes moved to him. He nodded, once. Small. Just acknowledging her. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the watch in her hands, turned it over once, the way you turn a problem over in your mind. Then she held it out toward him, slowly, at arm's length. Vince crossed the room and crouched beside the bed, took the watch gently from her hand, looked at it. The crystal was cracked across the face. One hand, the minute hand, was sheared off at the base. The case was dented on one side. It was an older watch, analog, the kind that someone had kept and worn for years, not because it was expensive, but because it meant something. He turned it over. On the case back, barely legible through the scratches, someone had engraved something. 4 words. He read them twice. Then he looked at the girl. She was watching him with those deep, hollow eyes, and in them, very small, was the first actual question he'd seen there, not the blank emptiness of earlier, an actual question, a wanting to know. "It's fixable," he said quietly. "I promise you that. It's fixable." He handed it back. She clutched it to her chest. He stood, looked at her for another moment. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, "if that's okay with you." She didn't answer, but her eyes didn't look away. He took that. The Iron Compass Clubhouse sat on the western edge of Millhaven in a converted auto repair bay that had been expanded, reinforced, and made deliberately uninviting to anyone who hadn't earned a reason to be there. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was, a place where men who had stopped fitting comfortably into the regular world had built something that fit them instead. The parking area was gravel and oil stains. The exterior lighting was functional rather than welcoming. There was a hand-painted sign above the main door that said, "Iron Compass MC," and beneath it, in smaller letters, the club's founding year. Inside, at 11:30 on a wet Thursday night, there were 4 men who had not yet gone home. Decker was behind the bar, doing inventory with the concentration of a man who finds arithmetic comforting, a habit left over from his years as an Army logistics sergeant, when counting and recounting supplies was the difference between missions that succeeded and ones that didn't. He was 53, broad across the back, with hands that had been broken and reset enough times that they had their own weather system. He'd been one of the first people to patch in after Vince started the club, back when the club was mostly the 2 of them sitting in Decker's garage drinking beer and figuring out whether they had anything worth building. Oz was asleep in the corner armchair that had been designated his by common consent approximately 3 years ago, and no one had ever moved. He was 48, wiry, former Navy corpsman, and he slept in short concentrated bursts the way combat medicine teaches you to sleep, ready to come fully online in under 4 seconds, which he demonstrated now when the front door opened. Leon and Griff were at the pool table in the back, playing without keeping score, the way they always played, which everyone else had come to understand meant they were actually just talking, and the pool table was an excuse to be doing something with their hands. Vince came in wet. They all looked at him. None of them said anything right away because 30 seconds of watching Vince Calloway walk was enough for any of them to read the broad strokes of what had happened. He moved differently when something was in him. He was always deliberate, always measured. That was just his baseline. But right now the deliberateness had weight to it, a density, like he was carrying something he hadn't put down yet. Decker put down his clipboard. Vince got himself a cup of coffee from the machine on the counter, old, thick, the kind that had been sitting in the pot long enough to constitute a commitment, and stood at the bar and drank half of it before he said anything. "I found a kid tonight," he said. Oz had come fully awake. Leon and Griff had drifted in from the back. No one sat. They stayed as they were, giving him the space of their attention without pressing. At the crash scene on Route 9, little girl, 8 years old maybe, she was sitting by the guardrail. Everyone else missed her. He looked at his coffee. She was holding a broken watch. Silence. "She's at St. Anthony's right now," he continued. "No ID. No family found yet. She's not talking. The doctors think she's got trauma-induced amnesia. She doesn't know who she is." A pause. "There was a tarp on the grass near the car, so whatever she doesn't remember right now is probably mercy." Decker said, "What are you thinking?" Vince looked up. "I'm thinking I'm going to start the paperwork for emergency placement. In the meantime, I want someone to go by St. Anthony's first thing tomorrow. Talk to the social worker, Delgado, 3rd floor. Make sure the girl knows somebody's coming." Leon, who had not spoken yet, said, "You already told her you'd be back." It wasn't a question. Vince looked at him. "Yeah." Leon nodded, once the nod of a man who already knows the shape of what's coming and has no particular problem with it. He was 44, quieter than the others, the kind of quiet that comes from having grown up in a house where noise brought consequences. He'd been a Marine. He'd seen the things Marines see. He'd come back from them differently arranged than he'd left, and he'd spent the decade since working out what the new arrangement was good for. "She got a name?" Griff asked. "Not one she can tell us," Vince said. Another silence. Different quality this time. "She needs one," Decker said. "For now, until we know." Vince drank the rest of his coffee, set the mug down, thought about those eyes staring at the middle distance beside the guardrail, thought about the way they'd tracked toward him when he'd crouched in the rain and said, "I see you." Thought about the watch in her small hands and the 4 words engraved on the case back that he'd read twice in the soft light of that hospital room. Still here, still trying, someone's handwriting, someone's message to someone. "Mia," he said. Nobody asked why. The process, as Delgado had warned him, was not fast. The background check took 3 days. The home assessment required a representative from the county to visit the clubhouse, which Vince arranged for a Tuesday morning when he specifically requested that Decker clean up the bar area and that Oz move the disassembled engine components from the common room to the workshop. The representative, a middle-aged man named Kowalski, who wore a short-sleeved dress shirt in 52-degree weather and had the expression of a man who had already decided what he was going to find, walked through the space with a clipboard and a silence that communicated volumes. He took 23 minutes. He looked at the common room, the kitchen, the guest room in the back that Vince had spent the weekend before the visit cleaning and furnishing with a bed appropriate for a child, a small bookshelf with a collection of books selected without any clear knowledge of what an 8-year-old liked, but with the best intentions Vince could bring to the task. He looked at the workshop. He looked at the bar area. He looked at Vince. "You understand that this is a temporary placement," Kowalski said, "pending identification of family." "I understand," Vince said. "The environment here is—" Kowalski paused, looked at the mounted iron compass charter on the wall, looked back at Vince. "Unconventional." "It's a home," Vince said. "People live here. Some of them eat here every day. Some of them just come by. It's what it is." "And the other members?" "Are good men." Vince held the other man's gaze without aggression. "I can provide letters of reference from the Veterans Outreach Program we run, from the county hospital that we did fundraising for, from the school in Deming where we built the playground 3 years ago. I can get you any documentation you need." Kowalski wrote something on his clipboard, looked at Vince one more time. "I'll submit my assessment," he said. The approval came through 4 days later. What? Vince drove to St. Anthony's on a Saturday morning in early November, which was behaving the way November in this part of the country always did. Iron gray sky, cold with a bite in it that wasn't quite winter, but was practicing, dead leaves moving in the gutters. He signed the necessary forms, spoke to Delgado, who had the expression of someone who is genuinely uncertain whether to be glad or cautious, and had settled on a careful version of both. He walked down the hall to the room that had been Mia's for almost 2 weeks. She was sitting up in the bed, dressed now in clothes someone had brought. A children's organization, Delgado had said. Donations. Jeans, a green sweater, the broken watch still on her wrist, where the nursing staff had apparently agreed to leave it because removing it had been the only thing that had made her genuinely distressed. She looked at him when he came in. He looked at her. "Hey," he said. She didn't answer, but she watched him the way she always did now when he came, with that careful, intent quality that wasn't quite trust yet, but was the territory just before trust, the place where a person is deciding whether the evidence is sufficient. "So," he said, and pulled the chair up beside the bed and sat down. "I talked to some people, and if you want to, you can come stay somewhere while we figure everything out." He leaned his forearms on his knees. "It's a little loud sometimes. The guys there are kind of," he thought about how to phrase it, "a lot, but they're good, and you'd have your own room, and I'd be there." He left it at that. Didn't oversell it. Didn't make promises about what it was going to feel like or how long it would take or how things were going to turn out, because he'd been in enough rooms with enough hurt people to know that overselling is its own kind of abandonment. Mia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the watch, touched the cracked crystal with one finger, looked back up. She nodded. Decker saw them coming through the front window. He had approximately 45 seconds to turn around and say, at volume, "She's here." And in those 45 seconds, a remarkable series of adjustments took place inside the Iron Compass clubhouse. Oz came awake from the corner chair and sat up straight, and somehow, in the space between sleeping and upright, managed to tuck in his shirt. Leon, who had been working on a carburetor at the work table near the window, moved the carburetor to the workshop with a speed that suggested it had been planned. Griff, coming in from the back with a sandwich, stopped in the middle of the room, looked at the sandwich, looked at the door, and put the sandwich behind the bar with a casualness that fooled no one. Remy, the youngest of them, 29, who'd come to the club 2 years ago after separating from the National Guard and spending 6 months not finding a solid reason to get out of bed in the morning, was on his phone and hung up so fast the person on the other end probably thought the call had dropped. By the time Vince pushed open the front door, the room had rearranged itself into something approximating casual that was clearly the result of 45 seconds of concentrated effort, and all 5 of them were looking at the door with expressions that were trying very hard to be normal. Mia came through the door holding the strap of a small, hospital-provided bag with both hands, standing slightly behind Vince's right shoulder, and looked at all of them. They looked at her. Nobody moved. Vince said, "This is Mia. She's going to be staying with us for a while." He looked around at them. "Mia, this is everyone. You'll learn the names. They don't bite." A beat. "Decker bites a little, but only if you mess with his inventory system." Decker looked pained. Mia looked at Decker. Then, very small, almost invisible, the corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't a smile. It was the ghost of where a smile would be if she remembered how. But it was something. But the first night was quiet. Vince showed her the room, the narrow bed with the clean blanket, the bookshelf with its imprecise selection of children's literature, and a few picture books that Decker had purchased with what Vince privately suspected was extensive internet research disguised as casual browsing. There was a window that looked out over the parking area, and beyond it the open scrubland that stretched toward the ridgeline. Nothing particularly beautiful about the view, but a lot of sky. Mia stood in the middle of the room and turned around once, slowly, taking inventory. "The door locks from the inside," Vince said. "You have the only key. The bathroom's at the end of the hall. If you need anything in the night, my room's the second door on the left. You can knock, anytime, doesn't matter." He paused. "You don't have to talk. You don't have to do anything. You can just be here." She was looking at the bookshelf. He let her. After a moment, she crossed to it and crouched down, reading the spines the way only someone who actually cares about books reads spines, with her head tilted and her finger hovering just above the surface. She pulled out a book near the bottom. The cover was worn, a faded illustration of a rabbit in a red jacket. She stood up with it and looked at Vince. "That's a good one," he said. He had no idea if it was. He'd never read it. She crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it, opened the book to the first page. He watched her for a moment. The lamp beside the bed cast a circle of warm light that made the room feel, briefly, like a different kind of place. "Good night, Mia," he said. She didn't look up from the page. He turned off the overhead light and left the lamp on and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, Decker was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his inventory clipboard held down at his side like he'd forgotten he was holding it. He looked at Vince. "She take the room?" he asked. "She took the room." Decker looked at the closed door for a moment. "She's going to be okay," he said. "Right?" Vince looked at the door, thought about those eyes in the rain, thought about the engraving on the caseback of the broken watch. Still here, still trying. "Yeah," he said, "she is." He wasn't certain he believed it yet, but he'd found over the years that some promises were worth making before you were certain, because the making of them was part of how they became true. He walked back out to the common room where the others were waiting. None of them had gone home. The watch was in 4 pieces by the following Tuesday morning. This was not a disaster. This was, in fact, the entire point. And Mia had executed the disassembly with a precision that stopped everyone in the workshop who happened to be watching, which was everyone in the workshop, which was all of them. Oz had found her sitting at the work table with a set of jeweler's screwdrivers that she had apparently sourced from the small tools cabinet without asking anyone, which suggested she'd either been in the workshop before or had an intuition about where things lived that went beyond what you'd expect from a child who'd been in the building for 3 days. She had the watch face up, crystal removed and set aside, case open, the movement exposed, and she was examining the gear train with the focused, analytical attention of someone who was not looking at a problem, but at a solution she hadn't quite found yet. Oz had stood in the doorway for about 90 seconds before he said anything. "You know what you're looking at?" he asked. She looked up at him, then back at the watch movement. She pointed at the arbor where the minute hand had sheared off. He crossed the room slowly and looked. She was right. The break was clean, not a malfunction, just a mechanical failure at a stressed point. It was fixable if you had the right replacement part and the patience to seat it correctly. "Huh," Oz said. He found the part in the bins of spare watch components that lived in the back of the parts cabinet, a leftover from someone's project years ago, and set it on the table in front of her. He didn't say anything about whether she could do it. He just put the part on the table and stepped back. It took her 40 minutes. 40 minutes of absolute focused silence, while Oz sat on the stool across from her and watched with the kind of unhurried attention he brought to medical procedures, present, respectful, not interfering. Twice he saw her hit a point of resistance where the tiny gear wasn't seating right, and both times he watched her stop, back off, recalibrate, and try again with the patience that no 8-year-old he'd ever met had for anything. On the 3rd try, it seated. She wound the watch once, held it up and listened. The tick was steady, clean. She looked at Oz. He looked at her. "That's real good," he said. She put the watch on her wrist, adjusted the clasp, looked at the face for a long moment. At the time it was showing, the moving hands, the restored function of something broken. Her expression was complicated. Something moved through it that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, and was probably something that lived between them, in the territory where loss and recovery touch. Then she reached across the table and pointed at a second watch that Oz had been ignoring in a box of items needing repair. "That one too?" he said. She picked it up. "Yeah, okay," Oz said. He leaned back on the stool. "All right, let's see what you can do." Word got around. By the end of the first week, Mia had a small collection of broken things. It started organically. Griff mentioned the watches to Remy, who mentioned to Decker that the kid had fixed the one from the accident, and Decker had a clock with a jam mechanism that had been sitting on the shelf behind the bar for 18 months. and he brought it to her without ceremony, just set it on the work table with a look that was mostly the look of a man who has tried to fix something himself and failed and is too pragmatic to be precious about asking for help. She fixed the clock in under an hour. Then Leon found an old transistor radio with a blown capacitor that he'd been meaning to repair since roughly 2 years before and had not repaired because electronics repair was several rungs above his skill set, and he was honest about his skill sets. He brought it to Mia on a Wednesday afternoon with the same lack of ceremony, just set it on the table, and she looked at it the way she looked at all the broken things, with that assessing, turning the problem over focus that was already becoming familiar. She didn't have the capacitor she needed, but she spent an hour mapping the circuit board anyway, making notes in the small notebook that had materialized on her work table at some point. Small, precise notations that were partly symbols and partly something else, a kind of technical shorthand that she'd apparently developed herself. Remy found the right capacitor at an electronics supply place on Thursday. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just left it on the table with a sticky note that said, "Think this is what you need," and disappeared back to whatever he'd been doing. The radio worked by Friday afternoon. She carried it to the common room and turned it on, and the sound that came out was old country, some station playing something with a steel guitar that nobody in the room would have admitted to liking, and she stood there with the radio in her hands and listened, and something in the expression on her face made Decker have to turn very quickly and find something very important to look at behind the bar. After a minute, she looked at Vince, who was on the couch with a cup of coffee reading something. He looked up. She held up the radio. "Not a question, just showing him." "Yeah," he said. "You did that." She sat down on the couch, about 2 feet away from him, and put the radio on the cushion between them, and they sat there in the late Friday afternoon with the steel guitar filling the room, and Vince didn't say anything else, and neither did she. Nobody else said anything either. The room was just there, around them, with its oil smell and its worn furniture and its collection of men who had all, in their different ways, been broken and found partial fixes, and the radio played. The jukebox was Vince's idea. It had been in the corner of the common room since before Vince founded the club, inherited from the previous occupant of the building, an old diner that had closed in the 90s. It was a 1957 Wurlitzer, all original chrome and color panels, and the kind of mechanical beauty that made people feel things before they even knew why. Internally, it was a disaster. The mechanism hadn't worked in at least 15 years. Every attempt to repair it had ended at the same point, a complexity of interlocked systems that defeated anyone who tried to take it apart without knowing what they were looking at. Vince had loved it for the whole time he'd known it, loved what it represented, music existing in an object, the idea of all those 45s lined up inside it, waiting for someone to find the right combination, the sense of something that worked beautifully and wasn't working anymore, pending the right kind of attention. He brought Mia to stand in front of it on a Saturday afternoon when the room was quiet. She looked at it. He looked at her, looking at it. "I've had people try to fix it," he said. 3 of them. None of them got it running. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I just thought you'd want to see it." She looked back at the jukebox, put her hands on the chrome panel on the side, very gently, the way you'd touch something that might be fragile. She bent down and looked at the mechanism through the clear panel at the bottom, stood back up, tilted her head. "Take your time," Vince said. "It's not going anywhere." He went and sat on the couch and let her do whatever she was going to do. What she was going to do, as it turned out, was spend the next 4 Saturdays systematically dismantling the Wurlitzer's mechanism, documenting every component in the notebook, building a map of how the systems related to each other, identifying the 3 points of failure that had defeated everyone else, sourcing the specific replacement components, which required 2 conversations with a vintage jukebox restoration supplier in another state. Conversations conducted through notes on paper that Vince typed and sent and received the replies to because she still wasn't speaking. And then rebuilding it. On the 5th Saturday, she finished. The room was full because word had gotten out, the way word always got out in a clubhouse, which is immediately and without anyone's permission. Everyone was doing things they would claim were coincidental to being there. Decker was doing inventory, Oz was reading, Leon was cleaning a carburetor he'd already cleaned twice. Griff was making coffee. Remy was on his phone. Mia pressed the selector button. The mechanism engaged. The arm moved. A 45 dropped. Music came out of the Wurlitzer for the first time in 15 years. Something from the 50s, a woman's voice with a full orchestra, something Vince couldn't name but that felt like it knew things. And the chrome panels lit up with their original colors, amber and green and red, and the whole machine became, in that moment, exactly what it had always been designed to be. A thing that held music until someone could bring it back. Nobody said anything. Mia turned around and looked at the room, and Vince, from the couch, saw something happen on her face that he had not seen there before. Something genuine and unguarded and all the way through her. Not the ghost of a smile, not the beginning of something, but the real thing. Full. Present. He made sure he wasn't the one who started it. He made sure it came from her. But when she looked at him, he let her see it on his face too. "Yeah," his expression said, "you did that." She looked away, looked back at the jukebox, watched the light catch the chrome. The song played. The room held. And nobody mentioned the fact that 3 of the men present were having serious difficulties with their eyes. The question that couldn't be answered was always there, underneath everything else. Delgado called every few days. The investigation was ongoing. They'd confirmed through vehicle registration that the car had belonged to James Allen Brooks. Records showed a wife, a daughter. They were working on locating next of kin. There was a trail, Delgado said carefully, but it was complicated by the way the family had apparently lived. Traveling, not rooted in any single address, the kind of people who paid cash and moved seasonally and left light impressions in administrative systems. Vince asked the same question every time Delgado called. How long? The answer was always the same kind of careful non-answer. He hired a private investigator on the 3rd week, a woman named Park, who worked out of an office above a dry cleaning shop and had been recommended by a lawyer the club occasionally used. She was precise and unsentimental and charged a flat rate that Vince paid in cash without blinking. Park asked him why. He told her about the crash, about the girl, about the broken watch. Park said, "That's not what I asked. I asked why you." Vince thought about it for a moment. "Because someone has to know who she is," he said. "She deserves to know who she is, whatever that turns out to be." Park studied him the way she probably studied all her clients. Then she said, "Okay, I'll get started, but..." The nights were the hardest part. Not for Vince, or not only for Vince, though he had his own version of the difficulty. The hardest part was for Mia. She slept. She slept adequately. But there was a pattern to her nights that Vince had mapped without intending to. He was a light sleeper himself, had been for years, and he heard her sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning. Not crying, not calling out, just moving, padding down the hallway to the common room, where the jukebox light was still on, a warm amber glow in the dark. He found her there on 3 separate occasions. The first time he came out and found her sitting on the floor in front of the jukebox, not playing anything, just sitting. He sat down beside her on the floor, back against the wall, and they sat there for about 20 minutes until she went back to bed. The second time he came out with 2 cups of warm milk that he made without speaking and brought to where she was and handed her one, and they drank them in silence. The third time, she was sitting there when he came out, and she looked up at him, and something in her expression was different. There was something in it that was trying to reach something it couldn't quite get to. A frustration underneath the usual quiet. An effort. He sat down on the floor beside her. She looked at the jukebox, looked at her wrist, at the watch face. Then she looked at him. Her mouth opened. She was trying. He waited. He kept his face absolutely still and present and gave her all the time she needed because he understood that this was not a small thing and he would not rush it, not for any reason. She pushed, 1 syllable, barely there, rough and effortful and small. But there. "Vince," he breathed once. "Yeah," he said. "I'm here." She nodded, looked back at the jukebox, closed her mouth. He sat there beside her in the amber light for another half hour, and neither of them said anything else. And he felt the particular quality of that silence, not empty, but dense. Full of something that hadn't found words yet but knew they existed, the knowledge of words, the beginning of returning. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He filed it away in the part of himself that kept the things that mattered most in the quietest place, because some things, if you speak them too loud, scatter. But when he went back to bed that night, the weight he'd been carrying since that rain-soaked highway felt, for the first time, not lighter exactly, but differently distributed, as if the thing being carried had shifted from something he was holding alone to something with handles on more than one side. He didn't sleep, but the insomnia felt different. He lay there and thought about Park and her investigation, and about the engraving on the caseback of Mia's watch, and about the particular look on a child's face when something broken works again, and what it means, and whether it means the same thing when the broken thing is a person. And then, at about 4 in the morning, his phone lit up with a message from Park. Found something. Not what you're expecting. Call me when you're up. He stared at the screen for a long moment. The jukebox was still on in the other room. He could hear it faintly. The mechanism cycling, choosing. The quiet before the music started. Found something. He sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there in the dark for a moment, on the edge of whatever came next. Because in his experience, in the long, scar-mapped experience of a man who had learned the hard way that the truth is rarely the shape you've prepared yourself for. The moment before you know is the last moment the story is still the one you've been telling yourself. After the call with Park, it would be something else entirely. His hand hovered over the phone. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark parking lot and the flat scrubland beyond it, and the sky just beginning to lighten at the far edge. Whatever Park had found, whatever Mia's real story was, whatever the engraving on that broken watch was trying to tell them, it was coming toward them, whether he made the call or not. He picked up the phone. Vince made the call at 4:17 in the morning. Park picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake too, which told him something about the weight of whatever she'd found. Talk to me, he said. She didn't do preamble. That was one of the things he'd come to appreciate about her in the 3 weeks she'd been working this. She said what she had, and she said it straight. James Allen Brooks and his wife, Clara Mae Brooks, died on the night of October 4th, Park said. Head-on collision on Route 9, southbound, during the rainstorm. Medical examiner confirmed both deceased at scene. It's in the county report. That's the same crash, Vince said. Yes. That's the crash I stopped at. Yes, Park said. I know. The window in front of him was starting to separate, sky from land, a thin seam of lighter dark at the horizon that wasn't yet dawn, but was the promise of it. Vince watched it without seeing it. The girl was in the car, he said. According to the registration and the family records I've been able to locate, there was a child, Emily Grace Brooks, age 8. The first responders report lists 2 occupants at scene. Park paused. 2 adult occupants. The responding officers logged the incident as a 2-person crash. The cold that moved through Vince Calloway in that moment had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. They didn't know she was there, he said. She must have gotten out, or been thrown clear and walked back. The impact zone and the position of the guardrail where you found her. Another pause, a careful one. She'd have had to cross about 40 feet of grass and gravel in the dark. After the crash. In the rain. 8 years old. After whatever she'd seen and after whatever she'd survived. 40 feet in the rain and the dark. And then she sat down beside the guardrail and held the watch and waited for something that didn't come until Vince happened to look in the right direction. She didn't wander away from a crash site, Vince said. She walked to the nearest solid structure and she sat down and she waited. Yes, Park said quietly. That's what I think too. He stood at the window for a long moment. The horizon was making real progress now, gray light accumulating at the edge of the world. What about family? He said. Next of kin. That's the complicated part. Park's voice shifted slightly. The Brooks family was nomadic is the best word I have for it. James was a musician. Clara, too. They traveled on a circuit, county fairs, music festivals, small venue bookings, some street performance, paid cash, rented week to week, no fixed address for at least the last 4 years. The last known permanent address was in Harlan County, Kentucky, and it's been abandoned for 2 years. Extended family. I found a reference to a sibling for Clara, a sister, Eleanor, last name, possibly married, name unclear, the records get thin. Paper sounds. There's a mention in a social services document from 7 years ago. Clara listed Eleanor as emergency contact at a clinic visit. I have a partial address in Western Tennessee, but it's old. How old? 6 years. You're going to find her anyway, Vince said. I'm going to find her, Park confirmed. But I want you to understand that even when I do, she may not be. There may be reasons the family lost contact. People don't always lose each other by accident. Vince thought about the engraving on the watch. Still here, still trying. Thought about the kind of person who writes that on the back of something and gives it to someone to carry. Find her, he said. Whatever the reasons are, find her. He hung up. He stood at the window until full dawn came, which took another 40 minutes, and the light that arrived was the thin, honest, unsparing kind that November delivers in this part of the country. Not warm, not flattering, just illuminating. Everything exactly what it was. No shadows left to hide in. He thought about a little girl walking 40 feet through rain and dark after the worst night of her life, and sitting down beside a guardrail and waiting. He thought about how long she'd been waiting and in how many different ways before he'd crouched down beside her. Then he went and made coffee, because the day was coming, whether he was ready or not. He told Decker first. This was the order things always went in, not because of hierarchy. The Iron Compass operated on a flat enough structure that hierarchy was mostly a fiction they used for paperwork, but because Decker was the one who had to know things before they became general knowledge, because Decker was the one whose reaction was the most reliable indicator of how the others would respond, and because Decker had a gift developed over 53 years of being large and quiet and observant, for saying nothing at exactly the moment when nothing was the right response. He said nothing for a long time after Vince told him. They were in the kitchen, 6 in the morning. Decker was making eggs because Decker always made eggs when he was working something through. The eggs were not important. The action of making them was. She was in the car, Decker said finally. Yes. With both of them. Yes. The spatula worked against the pan. Silence. And nobody knew. The first responders report logged 2 adults. She got out before they arrived. Or, Vince put both hands flat on the counter. She got out and walked to the guardrail and sat down and nobody looked. Until you. Until me. Decker pushed the eggs. Let them sit. You think she knows any of this? No. Her memory stopped somewhere before or during the crash. The amnesia is protecting her from something. I don't know how much or how little she carries. And when she knows. Vince had been sitting with this question since 4:17 in the morning. He didn't have an answer that satisfied him. She'll need to know eventually. It's her story. I'm not asking eventually, Decker said. I'm asking when. When we find the aunt. When there's someone to... He stopped, started over. I'm not going to be the one who tells her she's an orphan and then leaves her alone with it. Decker nodded. Set the eggs on 2 plates without asking if Vince wanted any, put one in front of him, and sat down across the table. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Outside, the morning was establishing itself. A bird somewhere. The sound of wind moving through the juniper at the edge of the lot. The guys are going to take it hard, Decker said. I know. Remy especially. He's been... A pause. You've seen how he is with her. Vince had seen. Remy was the youngest of them by a significant margin, and he related to Mia the way someone does when they see in another person's damage a map they recognize from their own territory. He'd been the one who found her the transistor capacitor. He'd been the one who started saving broken gadgets and leaving them on her work table without comment. He'd started doing it the way you start anything you're not entirely conscious of doing, gradually, and then very obviously, and by then it was simply what you did. I'll talk to everyone together, Vince said, tonight. Before or after she's in bed? After. Decker nodded, ate his eggs. The aunt, he said after a while, if Park finds her. What's she like? I don't know anything about her. But you're thinking about it. Vince looked at his coffee. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Like whether she's going to be good enough. The words sat there between them. Good enough. The particular bar that had been building, without anyone deciding to build it, over the past 3 weeks. The standard that existed now, whether any of them had named it or not. Yeah, Vince said. Like that. Decker picked up both plates and took them to the sink. His back was to Vince when he said, "You know we don't get to make that call." "I know. If she's got family." "I know, Decker." Silence. The water running. "I'm just saying it out loud," Decker said. "So it said." "I heard you." Vince pushed back from the table and picked up his coffee and walked out to the common room. The jukebox was dark and quiet. Mia's work table was empty. The small notebook sat at the corner of it, closed, the pencil laid precisely perpendicular to the edge. He stood there looking at it. He heard her a few minutes later in the hallway. The sound of her door, the sound of bare feet on the wood floor, the sound of her stopping in the doorway of the common room. He turned. She was looking at him with her morning face, still slightly soft from sleep, hair loose, the broken watch already on her wrist the way it was every morning because she put it on before she did anything else. "Morning," he said. She studied him. She was getting better at reading him, which was both reassuring and inconvenient because there was something in his face this morning that he was doing his best to keep behind the usual surface. She walked to her work table, sat down, opened the notebook to a fresh page, picked up the pencil. He watched her begin to draw. Not words, not circuit diagrams, but an image. He couldn't see it from where he stood, but he'd learned that her drawing was another form of the same language as her repairs. When she couldn't say something, she built it or drew it. He left her to it and went to stand outside with his coffee in the cold morning air. And he looked at the wide, flat sky over the scrubland and thought about the word good enough and how it was the only standard that had ever mattered in his life and how hard it was to know when it had been met. The tension started, as tension usually does in enclosed spaces, not with a single event, but with the accumulation of small frictions that each individually seemed negligible and collectively became a weather system. Remy was the first one to ask Vince directly. He found him in the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, mid-conversation with the engine of a 94 Softail that had developed a leak at the base gasket, and he stood in the doorway for a moment doing the thing he did when he had something on his mind. Weight shifting, jaw working, looking at a point slightly to the side of what he was actually looking at. "You gonna tell us what Park found?" he said. Vince didn't look up from the engine. "I told everyone what Park found last week." "You told everyone the broad strokes. The broad strokes are what I have." "Vince," Remy's voice was flat, not aggressive, just insistent in the way that young men are insistent when they've been patient for as long as patience feels reasonable. "Is there something you're not telling us?" Now Vince looked up. He looked at Remy for a moment. At the set of his jaw, the specific posture of someone whose concern had sharpened into something with an edge. 29 years old, which was old enough to have reasons not to trust things and young enough to still feel them sharply. "There are things I'm still working out," Vince said. "When I have more, I'll say more." "She's been here a month." "I know how long she's been here. So has Park. I know. The aunt. Remy." Vince put the wrench down and straightened. "When I know something solid, you'll know it too. That's all I can give you right now." Remy looked at him. The silence had the quality of a held breath. "She's getting attached," Remy said, and his voice had shifted slightly, the insistence dropping back into something rawer underneath it. "To this place. To all of us." A pause. "To you, specifically. You know that, right?" "Yes," Vince said. "I know that." "So if the aunt shows up and—" "I know," Vince said. "I'm thinking about it." Remy looked at the floor. His boot toe moved across a grease mark on the concrete, back and forth, the unconscious movement of something working through something else. Then he looked up. "I just want to know that we're—" He stopped, tried again. "I want to know that she's not going to end up somewhere worse than here, just because somewhere worse has better paperwork." Something in Vince's chest made itself known. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." It wasn't a promise, but Remy nodded like it was close enough to one to carry for now, and he left, and Vince picked the wrench back up and worked the base gasket and kept his hands busy because his hands were one of the ways he kept himself on the right side of things when the wrong side was looking comprehensible. The friction with Oz was different. Oz had been quiet in a different way since the morning Vince had told them about the crash, about what the first responders had missed. Not withdrawn. Oz was never withdrawn. His presence was too physical for that. But there was something he was carrying that he hadn't put down or named, and it sat in the room with him the way old injuries sit in a body. You knew it was there, not because the person said so, but because of the way they moved around it. Vince found him on the back steps on a Wednesday evening. Cold night, clear, the stars doing what stars do in this kind of dark, making the size of everything else apparent in a way that is either comforting or brutal depending on what you're carrying. Oz had a cigarette. He'd quit 3 years ago and restarted 4 times since, and he only smoked when something was in him that hadn't found another exit yet. Vince sat down beside him without saying anything. They were quiet for a while. The cold was the kind that enters through the jacket and settles around the bones, and neither of them moved to combat it. "I was a corpsman," Oz said. Not to Vince, exactly. To the dark. "I know," Vince said. "I've been at a lot of accident sites." He drew on the cigarette, exhaled. "Field situations, back home. Car wrecks, industrial stuff, the things that happen. I've seen the way people work a scene." He was quiet for a moment. "I've seen the things that get missed." Vince watched the smoke move. "She was right there," Oz said. 40 feet. In the dark, yeah, and it was raining, but she was 40 feet from the vehicle. She had a cut on her wrist that had been bleeding for... He stopped. "It wasn't a fresh cut when we looked at her, Vince. It had been bleeding for a while. Long enough." "I know." She sat there the whole time they worked that scene. His jaw was tight. The whole time they worked it, while her parents were... He stopped again. His throat moved. Nobody looked. "I looked," Vince said quietly. "Yeah." Oz was quiet for a long moment, then, "I know you did." He took another drag. "I'm not angry at you." "I know you're not." "I'm angry at..." A rough exhale. "I don't know what to do with it. That's the problem. There's no particular target that's going to help. The first responders were overwhelmed, and the rain was bad, and she was small, and people miss things in those conditions, and none of that..." He pressed the heel of his hand against his knee. "None of that means she should have been sitting there alone in the rain that long." Vince sat with that. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "I just need somewhere to put it," Oz said. "That's all. I just need a place to put the anger so I can be what she needs when she's in that workshop and she looks up." His voice was under control, but barely. "So I can be the right thing." Vince looked at him for a moment, at the side of his face in the cold dark, at the tightness in his jaw that had been there since last week and hadn't released. "You already are," Vince said. "You've been being it. That's not going to stop being true because you're also angry." Oz was quiet for a long moment. "Is she going to be okay?" he said. "I mean really, not eventually, not theoretically. Actually, okay." Vince looked at the sky, all those miles of dark between stars. "I don't know," he said, "but I know the people around her are going to make it possible. That's what we can give her, the possibility of it." Oz finished the cigarette, pressed it out against the step, held the dead thing in his fingers for a moment before putting it in his pocket because he'd never been the kind of man who left things on the ground. They sat there a while longer. Neither of them said anything else, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that two people who've been through things have after midnight in the cold, where the words are mostly architecture for the silence, and the silence is doing most of the actual work. The county fair came in the 3rd week of November, the kind of late-season event that exists partly out of tradition and partly out of stubborn local defiance of the calendar. It occupied the fairgrounds on the eastern edge of Millhaven for 4 days. Rides, livestock, crafts, the annual quilt competition that Vince had been hearing about for 7 years without ever actually witnessing. And it was Griff who suggested taking Mia. The suggestion met a complicated silence in the common room that lasted about 4 seconds, and during which approximately 6 different concerns moved across 6 different faces simultaneously. She's been cooped up, Griff said. She needs air. She needs to be around people her size. She's fine here, Remy said. She's fine here, and she needs to be around people her size, Griff said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at Vince. She should see something normal, even just for a few hours. Vince thought about it. He thought about the workshop and the jukebox and the small notebook and the way she moved through the clubhouse now, sure of the spaces, sure of the people in them, with the specific groundedness of someone who has learned the geography of a place by heart. He thought about what she hadn't yet seen or experienced since October, all of it held back by the necessary walls of the situation. He thought about what she'd lost, a life that had included county fairs, probably, music and travel and an ordinary childhood that had been traveling with her parents through a circuit of towns, seeing things, hearing things. Okay, he said. Griff didn't quite smile, but his face did something in that direction. They went on a Saturday, Vince, Griff, and Remy, which was the configuration that made most sense logistically and also the one Mia seemed most comfortable with, the three of them having established a kind of easy collective presence that she'd adapted to without apparent effort. She wore the green sweater and her jeans and the boots that Decker had found for her. Real ones, not kid shoes, because she'd indicated clear displeasure with the ones initially provided, pointing at the workshop and at her feet and back at the workshop, until Decker understood. And then he'd come back 3 hours later with proper boots that laced to the ankle and had enough sole for a person who spent time around machinery. And she walked between the three of them through the fair with the careful, wide-eyed attention of someone absorbing everything. Not overwhelmed, absorbing. There was a difference, and Vince watched her make it apparent in the way she moved, stopping at things that interested her, walking past things that didn't, with a selectivity that said she was taking in the world on her own terms, at her own pace. She stopped at the mechanical exhibits, spent 20 minutes watching a man demonstrate a vintage hand-cranked grain mill, spent another 15 at the blacksmithing demonstration, crouched at the safety rope, watching the forge work with the same focused intensity she brought to the workshop. She was uninterested in the rides. She was intensely interested in the food, not eating it, but watching the production of it. The funnel cake station where a man in an apron worked the batter with practiced efficiency. The kettle corn operation where the physics of heat and pressure and timing worked their particular alchemy. Remy bought her kettle corn anyway. She accepted it with the careful politeness she'd developed for gifts she hadn't asked for, and then she ate it in the slow, methodical way she ate most things, precisely, attentively, as if each piece was a small problem being solved. Vince was watching her when it happened. He was about 8 feet behind her, keeping the standard distance that gave her space without losing her. Griff was to her left, Remy slightly ahead, and he was watching the way the afternoon light hit her face when he noticed the woman. She was 60 maybe, small, with white hair pinned back under a hat, wearing the kind of clothing that belongs to a particular stripe of rural American womanhood, practical, unaffected, built for actual use. She was standing at the edge of the craft fair section about 15 feet from Mia, and she was looking, not glancing, not the casual noticing of a stranger. Looking, with an intensity that had a recognition in it so specific that Vince felt his spine respond to it before his brain had processed why. The woman took a step forward. Mia was still watching the kettle corn operation. The woman stopped about 10 feet away. She was very still. Her hands had come together in front of her, and she was holding them the way people hold their hands when they're trying to contain something. Vince moved. He crossed the 8 feet between himself and Mia in 4 steps, and was at her shoulder before the woman looked up at him. And the woman looked at him, and then at Mia again, and whatever recognition was living in her face went up about 3 levels of intensity. "Excuse me," Vince said. His voice was level, careful. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She was working very hard to maintain something in her expression that wanted to collapse into something else entirely. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was thin. I didn't mean to stare. It's just—" She stopped. Her gaze went to Mia again, and in it was something so specifically painful that Vince's hand had already moved to Mia's shoulder, a light, steady pressure that said, "I'm here," without alerting her to why. "Do you know her?" Vince said. Still level, still careful. The woman looked at him with eyes that had the quality of someone translating a fact that doesn't fit into the shapes language has for facts. "That child," she said slowly, "looks exactly like Clara May Hadley." A pause. "Clara May Brooks, I suppose. That's how she married." Her voice caught once, recovered. "I used to see Clara May every year at this fair when we were girls. She was my neighbor for 7 years. Vince kept his hand on Mia's shoulder, kept his voice steady. "What do you know about Clara May's family?" The woman's eyes came back to him. "I know she had a sister," she said. "Eleanor. Eleanor Hadley, before she married. I lost track of them when the family moved to Kentucky." She looked at Mia again. Is this Clara May's?" Mia had noticed the conversation. She'd turned slightly, the kettle corn held in both hands, looking at the woman with the careful, assessing attention she brought to unknowns. Vince crouched down beside her, kept his hand on her shoulder, spoke to her quietly, his voice below the ambient noise of the fair, just for her. "There's a woman here who thinks she might know something about your family," he said. "You don't have to talk to her. You don't have to do anything. I'm right here, but I want to ask her some questions, okay?" Mia looked at the woman. The woman looked at Mia, held very still. Then Mia looked at Vince. She nodded. Once. Small. He straightened and looked at the woman. "What's your name?" he said. "Ruth," the woman said. "Ruth Emmett. Tell me everything you know about Eleanor." That night, Vince called Park from the workshop after Mia was in bed. "Emmett gave me a first married name, he said. "Eleanor's. She was married a man named Garrett as of about 12 years ago. Ruth lost track after that, but she thinks they may have been in the Memphis area." He paused. "She also said something I need you to look into. She said the Hadley family, Clara May's family, had a history of what she called keeping to themselves. That Clara and Eleanor had a falling out years ago. She didn't know what about." Park was quiet for a moment. "A falling out could mean anything. It could mean the aunt is exactly what Mia needs," Vince said. "It could mean she's not. It could mean there's a reason the family was hard to find." He was walking the length of the workshop slowly as he talked, the way he always moved when he was thinking. The workshop smelled like oil and metal, and the particular combination of Mia's presence, a faint trace of the hand cleaner she used after working on things, a pencil and paper smell that had settled into the corner of her work table. "I need to know before she does." "Understood," Park said. "I'll follow the Garrett lead. Memphis area. That helps considerably." A pause. "Vince, you know that even if the aunt is problematic, if she's legally the closest family—" "I know the law," he said. "Then you know there are limits to what you can get." "I know," he said again. His voice was quiet, but had a quality to it that stopped Park from finishing the sentence. "I need to know who she is. That's all I'm asking. I need to know what Mia is going toward." Park said, "Okay. I'll have something by the end of the week." After he hung up, he stood in the workshop for a while. The jukebox was audible from here, faintly. Mia had played it before bed, something slow and old, and then the mechanism had cycled down to quiet. The whole building was asleep around him. He sat down at her work table, didn't touch the notebook, just sat there in the specific gravity of the space she'd made. The organized components, the small labeled bins of screws and gears that she'd sorted and cataloged in the 3 weeks she'd been using the table, the row of successfully repaired items along the back edge, waiting to be returned to whoever they belonged to. He picked up the nearest one, the old transistor radio, and turned it over in his hands, set it back down. He thought about Ruth Emmett's face when she'd looked at Mia, that specific pain of recognition, the way she'd said Clara May's name, like it was a thing she kept somewhere careful. He thought about the falling out, about what it meant to lose track of a family member, about all the ways that happened, by accident and by intention and by the slow, grinding accumulation of things that were never resolved and eventually became too heavy to carry toward each other. He thought about what Eleanor Brooks might look like when Park found her. He thought about what her eyes would do when she understood what had been found. The workshop was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a Harley sat in the cold. The temperature had dropped another 6 degrees since sundown, and the chrome would be ice cold to the touch now, the engine contracted and still. He could see it through the small window, the bike's silhouette against the parking lot lights, a shape that was both individual object and something larger, the way a flag is both cloth and idea. He'd bought that particular bike with the money from his last VA disability payment 3 years after he came home and 4 years after he stopped being the man he'd been when he left. He'd built it up piece by piece, which was also how he'd built most things since, piece by piece, incrementally, accepting that the result was going to be imperfect, and that imperfect and functional were the same thing in the ways that mattered. He thought about imperfect and functional for a while. Then he thought about what Park might find in Memphis. She found it in 4 days, which was fast, which told Vince something about how substantial the trail was once you had the right name. Eleanor Hadley Garrett, now Eleanor Brooks again, remarried after the divorce from Garrett, this time briefly and this time also ended, lived in a small town in western Tennessee called Dunmore. She was 54. She worked as a bookkeeper for a building supply company. She had no children. She had no criminal record. She had a history, Park reported carefully, of what a social worker's note from 11 years ago described as erratic contact with family and a pattern of periods of estrangement followed by periods of reestablished connection. She and Clara May reconciled about 6 years ago, Park said. Phone records I was able to access through the carrier's legal data show regular contact for the last 2 years. They were talking. They were in each other's lives. And Mia? Vince said. Given the contact timeline, Eleanor would almost certainly have known Emily existed. Whether she's met her in person, that I can't confirm. Vince absorbed this. She doesn't know, he said. Eleanor, about the crash. If she'd known, she'd have contacted authorities. There's nothing in any system showing she has, which means she thinks her sister is alive and her niece is alive, and the last 2 months have just been quiet. The thing that moved through Vince's chest in that moment had no good name. A woman, going about her ordinary November, working her bookkeeper's job. Maybe calling a number that wasn't being answered, thinking the road had taken Clara and James somewhere with bad reception, thinking she'd hear from them when the circuit brought them close to a cell tower. Waiting. Not panicking yet, maybe. Traveling musicians were unpredictable that way, not knowing. She needs to be told, Vince said. Yes, Park said. And Mia needs... He stopped. Mia needs to be told first, or at least simultaneously. I don't want Eleanor calling a system that's holding Mia before Mia knows what she's walking into. I can hold the information for 48 hours, Park said carefully. After that, I have an obligation to... 48 hours, Vince said. That's enough. But it wasn't enough. He'd already known, before he said it, that 48 hours wasn't enough for what had to happen. You didn't find the right 48 hours to tell an 8-year-old who had been living without her own name that the people it belonged to were gone. There were no right hours. There was only the wrong hours, and the less wrong hours, and the hours where you had the right people around you when you said it, and the hours where you didn't. He walked out to the common room. Mia was at the work table. She had the notebook open, and she was drawing something he could see from here, an intricate mechanical diagram, gears and linkages, something with a flywheel that appeared to be operating a larger system he couldn't quite resolve from this angle. She was doing what she always did when she was in the space that was entirely hers, moving in it with full occupation, without self-consciousness, without the careful peripheral awareness she maintained when she was in the social space of the group. She was just herself. He stopped in the doorway and stood there for a moment, just watched her. She must have felt the quality of his attention change because she looked up. Her pencil stopped. She looked at him. In his face was something he wasn't entirely succeeding at keeping out of it, and she was getting too good at reading him, and he saw the moment she registered that something was different. Her hands, both of them flat on the notebook, went very still. Her eyes asked the question her voice couldn't yet form with full ease, though she'd said his name twice more since the first time, small, careful deployments of the word. And once she'd said, "Watch," holding up her wrist and looked at him for confirmation. And he'd said, "Yeah, that's yours." And she'd nodded with a satisfaction that was also sadness and also something that wasn't either. The eyes asked, and they asked with the directness that children have when they haven't yet learned to look away from the things they need to know. Vince crossed the room, pulled the chair from the work table next to hers, and sat down. Close, not touching yet. He looked at the diagram she'd been drawing. Let a moment pass. That's complicated, he said, looking at the diagram. She looked at it too. You built that in your head? She looked at him, then down, made a small mark on the page, in addition to the flywheel mechanism. Then she looked back up. He put both forearms on the table, looked at his hands, thought about the 48 hours, thought about Park's careful voice. I found out something today, he said, about your family. The stillness that came over her was total, not frozen. She was breathing, he could see that, but absolutely still in the way that only people who have survived by being small and quiet can be still. Every bit of her attention concentrated on him. I'm not going to dump it all on you right now, he said. That's not... You deserve to have it in pieces, at a pace you can manage, with people around you. He looked at her. But I wanted you to know that I know, and that there's a person, someone related to you, someone who's going to want to know you're okay. A pause. Someone we're going to reach out to. When you're ready. Mia looked at him, her hands still flat on the notebook, her eyes doing the translation work, taking what he was saying and running it through whatever internal system she used to process things that were too large for immediate understanding, filing it somewhere she could come back to. Then, very slowly, she turned her hand over, palm up. He looked at it. He put his hand in hers. Her fingers closed around his. Not tight, just present. The grip of someone who is making sure the ground is there before they take a step. They stayed like that for a moment. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Whatever comes next, I'm not going anywhere. The jukebox was dark and quiet across the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the juniper, and the Harley in the lot rocked slightly on its kickstand. The lightest sway, the barest shift, the kind of motion that says the weather is changing. Something was coming. He could feel it the way he felt weather, in the body, before the sky confirmed it. He held her hand in the dark and in the quiet and felt the story gathering itself toward the shape it was becoming, and he understood, with the particular bone-deep comprehension of a man who has learned to read turning points, that the next thing that happened would be the thing that determined every subsequent thing. The 48 hours Park had given him were already ticking, and somewhere in Dunmore, Tennessee, a woman named Eleanor Brooks was probably sitting in her house right now, not knowing that the phone call that would change her life was already on its way. And somewhere behind the careful walls of whatever the child beside him remembered and didn't remember, a story was pressing against its own edges. The real story, the full story, the story with the name Emily Grace Brooks in it, and two parents, and a highway in October, and 40 feet of rain-soaked grass between the guardrail and the wreckage, and a broken watch that said "Still here," still trying on the back of its case, pressing against the edges, waiting for someone to open the door from the inside. Vince held her hand. The wind moved through the juniper. The weather changed. And 240 miles away, in a town called Dunmore, a phone began to ring in a small house where a woman was reading a book, and not yet knowing that the silence she'd been living in for 2 months was about to end in a way that would... Eleanor Brooks picked up on the fourth ring. Park had made the call. That had been Vince's decision. Not him, not Delgado, not the county system with its forms and its careful language. Park, because Park spoke in the flat, precise register of facts delivered without theater, and what Eleanor Brooks needed in the first 30 seconds was facts, not theater. Vince was in the workshop when Park called him back, 20 minutes after the call to Tennessee. She answered, Park said. How was she? A pause that lasted about 3 seconds longer than Park's pauses usually lasted. She'll need some time. I gave her the basics. I told her Emily is safe and well and in temporary placement. I gave her Delgado's number and yours. Another pause. She cried. She pulled herself together. She asked very specific questions. What kind of questions? Whether Emily was eating, whether she was sleeping, whether she was... Park stopped. She asked whether Emily laughed, whether she'd laughed at all. Vince stood with the phone pressed against his ear in the cold workshop and looked at the work table where Mia's notebook sat open to the mechanical diagram she'd been drawing when he'd come in with the weight of the truth in his face. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her I didn't have that information, but that the people caring for her would be able to answer." "She's coming," Vince said. It wasn't a question. "She's leaving tomorrow morning," Park said. "She'll be here by afternoon. She wants to meet Emily as soon as possible. She also—" A breath. "She wants to talk to you." "Okay." "Vince?" She asked about the crash, about how it happened, about the details. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was a weather-related accident, which is true." Park's voice was even. "I didn't tell her about the timeline, about how long Emily was at the scene before she was found." He understood the mercy in that. He also understood it wasn't sustainable. "She's going to find out eventually." "Yes," Park said. "But she's going to find out after she's sitting down somewhere with people around her, not on the phone with a private investigator at 11 at night." A pause. "I'll send you her number. She'd like to speak with you tonight if you're willing." "I'm willing," he said. He hung up and looked at the workshop for a moment. At the organized bins, the careful labels, the row of fixed things along the back edge of the table. He picked up the transistor radio, set it back down. Then he dialed the number Park sent him. Eleanor Brooks answered before the first ring completed, as if she'd been sitting with the phone in her hand. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, steadier than it had any reason to be, the kind of steady that comes from people who have had to be steady before and know how to make themselves that shape. "Ms. Brooks," he said. "Eleanor." "How is she?" And all the steady, all the controlled register of that voice cracked slightly on those three words. Not broke, cracked, the sound of someone pressing very hard against something very large from the other side of a wall. He told her. He told her about the workshop and the watches and the jukebox. He told her about the transistor radio and the grain mill at the fair and the way she moved through the clubhouse now with the certainty of someone who had learned the geography of a place. He told her about the notebook. He told her about the night in the common room when she'd said his name for the first time. He did not tell her about the 40 feet of grass in the rain. Not yet. Eleanor was quiet for most of it. When she did speak, it was in short, careful exchanges. Yes, she always did that, fixing things. She could take apart anything before she could read well. And Vince stored those pieces of information the way he stored all useful things, immediately and without ceremony. "Her watch," he said. "The one she was carrying when we found her. It has an engraving on the case back." Silence on the line. "Still here. Still trying," Vince said. A long pause, the kind that has weight. "That was Clara's," Eleanor said. Her voice had changed. "Clara gave it to Emily last year for her birthday." Another pause. "It's what Clara used to say to her when she was having a hard time. When she'd get frustrated at something she was trying to fix and couldn't. Still here, still trying. That was their thing." Vince closed his eyes for 1 second. "She kept it," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She would." They were quiet for a moment, both of them, on either end of 240 miles. "I'll be there tomorrow afternoon," Eleanor said finally. I need to see her." "She doesn't know everything yet," Vince said, "about her parents, about what happened. She knows something happened. She's been living with the edges of it. But I wanted to wait until there was someone from her family, who could be there when she knows the whole of it." Silence. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice had a quality in it he recognized, the quality of someone who is being given something they thought they'd lost the right to. "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Calloway." "Vince," he said. "Vince." A breath. "Thank you." He hung up and sat in the workshop in the cold and the quiet for a while before going back inside. He told the others in the morning after Mia was settled at her work table with a new project. A vintage alarm clock Remy had found at a thrift store. The mechanism seized solid, and after the coffee was made and the morning had established itself with enough routine to make the news land in a context rather than a vacuum. He laid it out in the kitchen, all of them standing because sitting felt wrong somehow. the way it sometimes does when the information is the kind that needs to move through a person rather than settle. He told them about Eleanor, about the call, about tomorrow afternoon. He did not tell them about what Eleanor had said about the watch. That belonged to Mia first. The responses were what he'd expected, and also not entirely what he'd expected, because people are always both. Remy went very still, his coffee mug held at chest height, both hands around it, and his face did something complicated that settled into an expression that was acceptance wearing the clothes of something it wasn't quite ready to be. He didn't speak. Leon nodded, slowly, the nod of someone who has been thinking about this moment for weeks, and finding out that thinking about something and having it arrive are two different weights. Griff said, "Is she good?" Meaning Eleanor. Meaning, is she what Mia needs? "She sounds like she is," Vince said. "Sounds like," Griff said. "That's what I have." Decker was looking at the window. Not through it. At the reflection of the room in the early morning light, the reversed image of all of them standing in the kitchen. He said, "What does Mia know?" "That there's family, that someone's coming, not the specifics." Vince set his mug down on the counter. "I'm going to tell her this morning, before Eleanor arrives. She needs time with it before she has to perform anything for anyone." "She's not going to perform," Remy said. His voice had an edge to it that wasn't directed at Vince, but had to go somewhere. "I know," Vince said. "That's not what I meant." A silence. "How long does she have?" Remy said. "After Eleanor comes. How long before they—" "I don't know the timeline," Vince said. "That's Delgado and the county. Eleanor will need to go through formal channels to establish custody. It takes time. So she's still here. For now." "For now." Remy put his mug down on the counter and walked out of the kitchen. His boots were loud on the wood floor, and then the side door opened and closed, and there was the sound of the cold outside receiving him. Nobody said anything. Decker turned from the window. "Give him a minute," he said. Not to anyone in particular. They stood in the kitchen with the coffee cooling and the morning doing what mornings do, and Vince thought about 240 miles and a woman who'd asked if the child laughed. "Da, he told Mia at 9 o'clock. He brought her a cup of warm milk. They'd developed this, the warm milk in the morning when there was something to sit with, and he pulled the chair up beside her work table and he told her. He told her in the order that felt right, which was not chronological but emotional, starting with Eleanor, with the fact of her, with the reality that she existed and was coming and wanted to see Mia and had said that Clara used to say, still here, still trying, and that was their thing, starting there, with the part that said you were loved before moving to the part that explained the shape of the loss. He told her about the crash, about her parents. He told her as plainly and as carefully as he could, which meant plainly enough to be true and carefully enough to be bearable, which is a narrower corridor than it sounds. She was very still while he spoke, hands flat on the work table, eyes on the seized alarm clock in front of her, though he understood she wasn't seeing it. When he finished, the silence lasted about 30 seconds. Then her hands came off the table and she put them in her lap, and she looked down at them, and something happened in her face that Vince had been prepared for. The grief. The weight of the understanding arriving, the way loss lands when it finally has a shape it fits, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and stayed close and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment needed. She cried for about 7 minutes, not the loud, gasping kind, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from somewhere very deep and has been waiting for permission and moves through a person like water finding the lowest place. She didn't reach for him and he didn't reach for her. He stayed present and close and still, which was what she needed, which was someone who could hold the weight of the room steady while she moved through something that had to be moved through. After 7 minutes, she stopped. She wiped her face with both hands in the methodical, practical way she did most physical things. She breathed twice, slowly. She picked up the alarm clock and looked at it, put it back down. Looked at him. "Eleanor," she said, the word careful and new in her mouth. "She's coming today?" "This afternoon," he said. She nodded. "She loved your mom," he said. "She asked me on the phone last night whether you'd laughed since being here." He paused. "She wanted to know if you'd been okay enough to laugh." Mia looked at him. Have you? He said. For the record, something moved across her face. Not the full smile, not the jukebox smile, but the ghost of its older sibling, something worn and real and complicated. Once or twice, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. Mad. Eleanor Brooks arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon in a 12-year-old Civic that had done the 240 miles in good faith, if not good comfort, and she parked in the Iron Compass lot and sat in the car for about 3 minutes before she got out. Vince watched from the window. She was smaller than he'd expected. Mid-50s, the build of someone who had always been slight and had stopped trying to be otherwise. Dark hair going gray, cut practical. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she stood beside the car after she got out and looked at the clubhouse with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing. He went out to meet her. She looked up when she heard his boots on the gravel. Looked at him. Made whatever assessment people make in the first 3 seconds of a face, and whatever she found there must have been sufficient because some of the careful tension in her expression released a small degree. "You're Vince," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Eleanor." She looked at the building. "It's not what I pictured," she said. "What did you picture?" She thought about it honestly. "Darker," she said. He almost smiled. "Come inside." He'd prepared the room as much as the room could be prepared, which meant Decker had cleaned the bar area, and Oz had moved the project materials off the common room table, and Griff had made a fresh pot of coffee, and all of them had agreed, without explicit discussion, to be elsewhere unless called upon. Leon had taken Remy out on a ride an hour ago, which was both tactful and probably good for Remy's current state of mind. Mia was in her room. Vince brought Eleanor inside and gave her coffee and let her stand in the common room and take in the jukebox and the worn furniture and the Iron Compass charter on the wall and the work table in the corner with the notebook on it and the row of fixed things along its back edge. Eleanor looked at the work table for a long time. "She's been fixing things," Vince said. "She always was," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. She crossed to the work table and stood in front of it and looked at the organized bins, the labeled categories, the careful notation on the outside of each one in Mia's small, precise handwriting. Since she was 5 years old. Claire used to say Emily could hear when something wasn't working right, like a pitch that bothered her until she fixed it. She put one hand on the edge of the table, didn't touch anything on it, just steadied herself. "I haven't seen her since she was 6, Eleanor said. 2 years ago. The family was on the circuit in Tennessee, and I drove 2 hours to meet them in a parking lot outside of Nashville, and we had lunch, and I watched Emily take apart my watch band and put it back together in better condition than it started." She stopped. Her throat moved. 2 years. "People lose time," Vince said. "Some of us lose more than others." She turned from the table. Her eyes were wet, but her face was held together. "I'm not going to fall apart in front of her. I want you to know that. Whatever I need to do in private, I'll do in private. She doesn't need to carry my grief on top of her own." He looked at her. This woman who had driven 240 miles and was standing in a biker clubhouse in a town she didn't know and was making promises about her own composure so that a child she hadn't seen in 2 years didn't have to carry extra weight. "She's been carrying a lot already," he said. "She's strong. She can handle more than you'd think." "I know," Eleanor said. "She's Clara's daughter." A pause. "Is she ready to see me?" Eleanor asked. "I'll find out," Vince said. He knocked on Mia's door and opened it when she answered. She was sitting on the bed with the book, the faded rabbit cover which she'd read 4 times now, which he understood was about the book as anchor more than the book as story. She looked at him. "She's here," he said. "You don't have to come out, not until you want to, but she's here." Mia looked at the book, then at him. Then she swung her legs off the bed and stood up and straightened her sweater with both hands and walked to the door. He stepped back. She walked out into the hallway. What happened in the common room in the next 40 minutes was not something Vince cataloged in detail. Some things earn their privacy even in memory, and a child's first meeting with the last remaining person who shares her blood after the 2 months she'd lived through was one of them. He stood near the doorway and was present and was invisible in the way that only people who are genuinely committed to invisibility can be. and he watched Eleanor Brooks sit down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor, cross-legged, so she was at Mia's level. And he watched Mia stand about 4 feet away and look at her with the careful, assessing attention that he'd come to know as her way of determining if a thing was safe. Eleanor didn't rush it. She sat on the floor, and she talked, quietly, and what she said was things about Clara. Specific things. The way Clara laughed too loud at her own jokes, the song she sang off-key when she was driving, the way she made pancakes in the shape of animals but could never quite get the ears right on the rabbits, and would become deeply, genuinely offended when anyone pointed this out. Mia listened. Something was happening in her face that Vince hadn't seen before. A different kind of attention. A reaching attention. The face of someone being handed pieces of something they'd lost and fitting them back into a shape they hadn't been able to see clearly without the pieces. After a while, Mia sat down on the floor too. About 2 feet from Eleanor. Eleanor kept talking. She pulled something from the canvas bag, an envelope, photographs, the physical kind, the size that used to get printed at drugstores. She laid them on the floor between them and let Mia look. Vince couldn't see the photographs from where he stood, but he saw Mia's face when she looked at them. He saw the moment. He'd known it was coming, knew the photographs were why Eleanor had brought them, knew that images have a different relationship to locked-away memory than words do, knew that the right face in a photograph can be a key to rooms that everything else has failed to open. He saw the moment the first room opened. Mia picked up one of the photographs, held it in both hands, stared at it, her lips moved. A word. Then another. Eleanor was very still. Mia looked up from the photograph. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her hands were steady. "Mama used to sing that song," she said. Her voice was thin and rough and entirely present. "When she drove, she sang it wrong." Eleanor's careful composure cracked. She pressed her hand over her mouth for 3 seconds. Then she breathed and said, "Every single time. Wrong every single time. Your dad used to say she was doing it on purpose, and she'd act so insulted." A sound came out of Mia that Vince hadn't heard before. Not a laugh exactly. Too wet for a laugh. Too thin. But from the same place a laugh comes from. The place where things that were lost prove they still exist somewhere inside you, just waiting for the right evidence. Vince walked out of the common room. He went to the workshop and he sat on the stool by the work table and he put both his hands flat on the surface and he stayed very still for about 5 minutes. Then Decker's footsteps came across the lot and the workshop door opened. "How is it?" Decker said. "Good," Vince said. His voice had a quality in it that Decker recognized and didn't remark upon. "It's good." Decker leaned in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a while. "She's going to remember," Decker said eventually. "More of it. Now that Eleanor's here and the photos—" "Yeah," Vince said. "That's what she needed." "Yeah." Another pause. "And the other part," Decker said. "The part she doesn't remember yet. The crash itself. What she saw." Vince looked at his hands on the table. "That's going to come back too. Eventually. Dr. Hesse at the hospital said it might come in pieces, or it might come all at once, and there's no predicting which." He was quiet for a moment. "When it does, she's going to need people who can hold that with her." "She'll have Eleanor," Decker said. "She'll have Eleanor," Vince agreed. "And Eleanor she seems like the right person." He looked up. "She sat down on the floor, Deck. First thing. Just sat right down on the floor so she'd be at eye level." Decker looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded with the particular economy of a man for whom a small, precise gesture says everything that needs to be said. "I'm going to make dinner," Decker said. "Something real. None of that heat from a can business." "She likes the pasta," Vince said. "I know she likes the pasta." Decker's voice was gruff in the specific way it got when he was doing something that mattered and wanted to make sure everyone understood he wasn't being sentimental about it. "I've been cooking for her for 3 weeks. I know what she likes." He left. Vince stayed in the workshop. He thought about Eleanor on the floor with the photographs between them. He thought about the sound Mia had made, that thing that was almost a laugh. He thought about still here, still trying on the case back of the watch, and Clara singing a song wrong on purpose, and a child who could hear when something wasn't working right. He thought about the next part, The part that came after reunion, the part that was more complicated than reunion, where temporary became something else, where the geometry of belonging had to rearrange itself, and where every person involved would have to figure out what they were to each other in the new configuration. He sat with that for a while. And then, from somewhere in the clubhouse, muffled through walls, through the cold air of the workshop, he heard the jukebox start. Not Mia running it, the mechanism cycling on its own, the way it sometimes did in the evening when the temperature dropped and the old electrical components did what old electrical components did. Music came through the walls. Something slow. Something from the 50s, a woman's voice with strings, the kind of song that had been written to carry weight and had been carrying it ever since. He listened. He stayed on the stool, and he listened to it come through the walls of the workshop, thin and warm and real, and he thought about the word home and all the shapes it could take, and about a little girl who had learned to find herself in broken things, and about the particular miracle of a thing that works again after everyone else has given up on it. The song played. He stayed. And in the common room, behind the walls, a child who had been nameless for 2 months looked at a photograph of her mother, and for the first time since the rain and the dark and the guardrail and the 40 feet of wet grass, she knew exactly who she was. Emily Grace Brooks. Still here, still trying. The call came at 11:43 at night. Vince was still in the workshop when his phone lit up with Park's number, and something in the timing, the lateness, the specific quality of a number calling when it had no business calling, brought him fully upright before he answered. "Talk," he said. Park's voice was different. Stripped of the usual precision, the way a tool sounds different when it's being used past its design tolerance. "I need you to listen carefully and not react until I'm finished." "Go." "The crash on Route 9. A breath. "I went back to the accident report. The full report, not the summary. There's a discrepancy in the timeline that I initially attributed to clerical error. And now? And now I don't think it was clerical error. Paper sounds. Keyboard. The vehicle that James Brooks was driving, the sedan, had a point of impact on the driver's side door consistent with a secondary collision, not the barrier. Something hit that car before it hit the barrier." The workshop went very quiet around Vince. "A second vehicle," he said. "A second vehicle. And the paint transfer on the driver's door, I had a contact at the state lab pull the spectrographic analysis that was filed, and then apparently not followed up on. It's not from a guardrail. It's not from the barrier. It's from another vehicle's panel, dark blue or black. Late model." "Someone hit them," Vince said, and drove away. "Someone hit them," Park said, "and the original investigation logged it as a single vehicle weather accident and closed it in 72 hours. A pause. "Vince, I need to tell you that the lead investigator on that case filed for early retirement 8 days after the accident. The cold that moved through him this time was a different cold than the one from before. This one had direction." "Who was he?" Vince said. "Detective Sergeant Raymond Coyle, 15 years with the county sheriff's department. His retirement package was processed the same week his report was finalized." Park's voice was very controlled. "I found a financial disclosure he filed in connection with a property transfer 3 weeks after the accident. He purchased a lake house in cash." The workshop was very silent. Outside, the wind had come up. He could hear it moving through the juniper, hear the creak of the lot signs, hear the faint percussion of something loose somewhere on the building's exterior. "Someone paid him," Vince said. "That's what the evidence suggests." "To close the case?" "Yes." "Which means someone knew what they'd done." "Yes," Park said, "and had the resources and the connections to make it disappear in 72 hours. Vince stood up from the stool. His body was doing the thing it did in situations that required full engagement, the cold focus, the narrowing of attention to what was immediately actionable, the compression of everything peripheral into silence. He'd learned it in places he didn't talk about, and it had never entirely left him. "Do you know who owns the second vehicle?" he said. "I have a partial plate from a gas station security camera 2 miles from the accident site," Park said. "Timestamp puts it at the right window. I ran it through a contact. The plate comes back to a shell company, but the registered agent for the shell is a man named Douglas Farrell." A pause that had weight in it. Douglas Farrell is the chief of staff for County Commissioner Harold Vane. Silence. A politician, Vince said. His driver, Park said, or someone using his vehicle. I can't confirm who was behind the wheel. But Vane has the resources, the connections to the sheriff's department, and a reputation for making problems manageable. Park's voice was flat. He's been county commissioner for 11 years. He's up for a state senate seat in the spring. Vince thought about October 4th, a rainstorm, a family of 3 on a highway, a collision, 2 adults dead, a child walking 40 feet through the dark and the rain to sit beside a guardrail and hold a broken watch. And somewhere, that same night, a decision being made, a calculation being run, a phone call being placed to someone with 15 years on the force and a willingness to be managed. Emily, Vince said, if Vane knows there was a surviving witness, she was never identified in any official report, Park said quickly. As far as the official record is concerned, there was no child. The first responder logs list 2 adult occupants. Emily Grace Brooks doesn't exist in connection with that crash in any document that Vane or his people would have access to. Unless someone told them, Vince said. Silence. Park. I've been careful, she said. Every contact I've used has been, how careful is careful? A pause that lasted 1 second too long. Get out of your office, Vince said. Right now, tonight, go somewhere else. Vince? Right now, he said. Pack what you need and go. Call me when you're somewhere else. He hung up. He stood in the workshop for 4 seconds. Then he moved. Mutsy. He crossed the lot in 8 steps and came through the side door of the clubhouse, and his boots on the floor were enough. The sound of them, the specific rhythm of Vince Calloway moving with intent. The Decker was already up from the couch before Vince reached the common room doorway. Decker looked at his face. Get everyone, Vince said. Now. Decker went. Vince went to the common room and stood with his back to the jukebox and waited while the building assembled itself around him. Oz from the back, rubbing sleep from his face and reading the room in 2 seconds and becoming fully present. Griff from the kitchen, Decker back with Remy, who'd been in the bunk room. Leon was the last one in. He took one look at Vince and crossed his arms and waited. Vince told them. He kept it short. The second vehicle, the paint transfer, Coyle, the lake house, Farrell, Vane. The room was very quiet when he finished. Remy said, they killed her parents. His voice was flat. And paid someone to bury it. The evidence points that way, Vince said. And now there's a witness, Oz said, who's been in our house for 2 months. Who nobody official knows about, Vince said. Park says the record is clean. Emily doesn't exist in any document connected to that crash. Park says, Griff said. The 2 words carried everything. Vince looked at him. Yeah, Park says. Griff held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. His jaw was tight. What do we do? First thing, Eleanor and Emily don't stay here tonight. Vince's voice was level and absolute. I'm going to wake Eleanor now, and I'm going to explain enough that she understands the need to move without explaining so much that she panics. There's a motel in Deming, 40 minutes west. Decker, you're going to drive them. You're going to stay. Decker nodded once. The rest of us, Vince said, are going to spend the next 3 hours making sure we understand exactly what we have and exactly how to present it to someone with the jurisdiction and the motivation to do something with it. He looked at Oz. The State Attorney General's office has an organized crime and public corruption unit. I want their direct contact before dawn. I know someone, Oz said. Former Navy, works prosecution out of the Capitol. He'll take the call. Make it. Oz was already moving. Remy had not moved. He was standing at the edge of the room with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes on Vince, and there was something in them that Vince needed to address directly, or it was going to become its own problem. Remy, he said. Remy looked at him. She is safe, Vince said. That's the first job. The second job is making sure it stays that way. Both of those things happen through the right channels, done right, done now. Not through anything else. Remy's jaw worked. He was at a campaign event, he said. Vane. I saw him on the news last week, shaking hands, smiling. His voice had a quality to it like metal under pressure. While she was in that hospital room, not knowing her own name. I know, Vince said. He should... Remy. Vince's voice was quiet, but had enough in it to stop the sentence. I know what you're feeling right now. I'm feeling it too. And the most effective thing we can do with that feeling is put it somewhere useful. He held the younger man's gaze. We build the case. We make the calls. We do it clean. Because dirty gets thrown out, and clean puts him somewhere he can't shake hands from. You understand me? A long moment. Remy breathed out through his nose, looked at the floor, looked back up. Yeah, he said, tight, contained. Yeah, okay. Vince put a hand on his shoulder for 1 second, then he turned to the hall. He knocked on Eleanor's door at 12:15. She opened it in under 10 seconds, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd heard enough of the last 20 minutes to know the shape of something without the specific details. She looked at him. Her face was composed. Her eyes were doing a calculation he recognized. The calculation of someone rapidly determining what information they need in order to do the next right thing, without the luxury of processing everything that's in the information. How much trouble, she said. Enough that I want you and Emily somewhere else tonight, he said. I'll explain fully when there's time. Right now I need to know if you trust me enough to move in the next 10 minutes. She looked at him for 3 seconds. 10 minutes, she said. Give me 8. She closed the door. Vince stood in the hallway. He could hear Oz on the phone in the common room, low and direct. He could hear Griff and Leon in the workshop pulling what they needed. He could hear Decker getting the truck keys from the board by the side door. 8 minutes later, Eleanor came out with the canvas bag and Emily beside her. Emily in her coat with the broken watch on her wrist, blinking against the hallway light, hair loose, looking at Vince with the full direct attention she gave to things that needed to be understood. She looked at his face. We're going somewhere else for tonight, he said. Decker's going with you. It's okay. He crouched down to her level. I'll explain everything. But right now I need you to go with Eleanor and Decker and trust that I know what I'm doing. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the broken watch. Not the one on her wrist, another one, the small bedside clock from her room that she'd been working on, still not running, and she held it out to him. He looked at it. He took it from her. She looked at him with those deep, direct eyes. You'll fix it, she said. Not a question. His jaw tightened. 1 second. Then it released. Yeah, he said, I'll fix it. She nodded, turned, took Eleanor's hand and walked with Decker toward the side door. Vince stood in the hallway and watched them go, the small clock held in both his hands, and he listened to the truck start in the lot and the sound of it moving through the gravel and out onto the road, and the sound diminishing and the dark taking it. Then he turned. The common room was lit up, Oz on the phone writing fast, Remy at the table with the documents Park had sent, organizing them with the focused precision of someone who has decided to be useful rather than what he'd been 10 minutes ago. Griff standing at the window, watching the road. Leon was standing in the middle of the room, arms crossed, looking at Vince. How do you want to do this? Leon said. Vince set the small clock on the work table, exactly where Emily's notebook usually sat. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he looked at Leon and the others, at the room around him, at everything that had been built here, and what it had become, and what it was now being called to be. We do it right, he said. We do it so it sticks. Outside a Harley somewhere on the far road, Decker, taking the long way, the careful way, the way that didn't go past anything that mattered too directly, the sound of it carrying in the cold night air, steady and sure. Vince sat down at the table, and the iron compass went to work. The state attorney general's office moved faster than Vince had expected, which told him that Oz's contact had weight behind him and that the case Park had built was cleaner than anyone had a right to hope for at 4 a.m. By 6 a.m., 2 investigators from the Public Corruption Unit were sitting in the Iron Compass common room drinking Griff's coffee and going through Park's documents with the focused, unhurried attention of people who understood that speed matters less than completeness. They asked good questions. They asked them without theater. Vince answered everything, and they wrote it down, and they didn't promise anything except that they would follow the evidence where it went. That was enough. Coyle was brought in for questioning 9 days later. He didn't hold for long. 15 years on the force had given him a precise understanding of the difference between loyalty that protects you and loyalty that burns you. And the lake house and the cash purchase and the financial disclosure were the kind of evidence that makes the math very clear, very fast. He gave them Farrell within 48 hours. Farrell, facing the weight of a vehicular manslaughter charge and a conspiracy count that carried 15 years minimum, gave them Vane's chief of staff's direct involvement by the end of the week. Vane himself resigned from the county commissioner position on a Tuesday morning in December, in a prepared statement that cited personal reasons and the need to spend time with family, which was the particular language that politicians use when the alternative language is too accurate to survive. The state Senate campaign ended the same day. The investigation stayed open. These things took time, the right kind of time, the careful documented kind that builds cases that don't fall apart under appeal. Park stayed on it. Oz's contact stayed on it. Vince was called twice more to give statements, and he gave them, clean and complete, and then he came home each time and went to the workshop and worked on something with his hands, until the feeling that lived in his chest after those conversations settled into something manageable. He did not feel like justice had been served. He felt like justice had been initiated, which was different, and was what was actually available. And he had made his peace with the difference because the alternative was to let the distance between what should happen and what does happen eat him from the inside. And he had watched that happen to better men than him, and he was not going to let it happen to himself. Emily Grace Brooks needed him to still be standing. That settled it. Eleanor stayed in Mill Haven through December. She'd taken leave from the bookkeeping job. Her employer, she told Vince with the slight dry tone he'd come to recognize as her version of humor, had been more understanding than she'd expected, possibly because she'd worked for them for 6 years without taking a single personal day and had apparently been accruing goodwill at a rate she hadn't tracked. She found a short-term rental 2 miles from the clubhouse. She drove over every morning. The formal custody process moved through the county system with Delgado shepherding it, which meant it moved with the particular combination of genuine effort and institutional friction that characterized everything Delgado touched. Slow in the ways that couldn't be helped, and fast in the ways that could. Eleanor's background check came back clean. The home assessment of her rental was completed. The paperwork built itself one layer at a time toward the shape of something official. Emily lived at the clubhouse through all of it. This was Vince's clearest understanding of what Eleanor was, that she never once pushed for the transition to happen before Emily was ready for it, that she accepted the pace that Emily set without complaint, that she showed up every morning and stayed until Emily was tired and then drove back to the rental and came back the next day. She integrated herself into the rhythm of the place gradually and without imposition, the way water finds its level. She learned everyone's name in the first week. She learned their coffee orders in the second. By the third week, she was sitting at the bar in the evening having quiet conversations with Decker about inventory systems that Vince was fairly certain Decker had been waiting his entire adult life to have with someone. And the two of them had developed what appeared to be a genuine mutual appreciation that nobody had predicted and everyone privately approved of. She watched Emily in the workshop without intruding. She learned to bring the broken things rather than asking questions about them. She learned the specific quality of attention that the room gave to Emily's work, present, respectful, not hovering, and she adopted it naturally, as if she'd always understood it. One afternoon, Vince came into the workshop and found Eleanor sitting on the stool across from Emily the way Oz always sat, just there, available, watching, while Emily worked on a small brass compass that Remy had brought in with a stuck needle. Eleanor was not saying anything. Emily was not saying anything. They were just in the same space together, doing what they each did in that space. And the quality of the silence between them was the particular quality that takes time to build and cannot be manufactured. He backed out without either of them seeing him. The county fair held a winter exhibition in January, a smaller version of the November event, focused on crafts and mechanical arts, the kind of thing that happens in small communities because the people in them have things they've made and want to be seen making them. Emily asked to go. Not through Vince, she asked Eleanor directly, in the matter-of-fact way she'd begun to do things that 3 months ago she would have communicated through gestures and notes. Her voice had come back in stages, the way feeling comes back to a limb that's been asleep. Pins and needles first, then warmth, then full use. It was quieter than Vince suspected it had been before October. But it was hers. She wanted to show something, she told Eleanor. She'd been working on it for 3 weeks in the workshop during the hours after Eleanor left in the evenings, and she hadn't shown anyone what it was until the morning of the fair, when she carried it out of the workshop in both hands and set it on the common room table. It was the engine block from the 1948 Harley that had been sitting disassembled in the back of the workshop since before Vince founded the club. The previous owner of the building had left it. It had been a project that various members had picked up and set down over the years without completing, the internal mechanism too corroded and complex for anyone to see a clear path through. Emily had found the path. The engine was not running. It would need a frame and a fuel system and a great deal more work before it ran, but it was clean and assembled, and every component was in its correct relationship to every other component. The timing right, the tolerances restored, the whole mechanism in a state of readiness it hadn't been in since Eisenhower was president. She had also polished the chrome. The room was very quiet when she put it on the table. Remy made a sound that he immediately tried to disguise as clearing his throat. Griff looked at the ceiling briefly. Oz picked up the engine and turned it over in his hands with the careful reverence of a man holding something that has been brought back from somewhere most things don't come back from. "This is real good," Oz said. His voice had the same quality it had the first time, over the transistor radio. Present, honest, refusing to be anything but what it was. "Emily, this is real good." She looked at him, looked at the engine. "It needs a home," she said. "The whole bike. It needs someone to finish it." She looked at Vince. He looked at her. He looked at the engine in Oz's hands. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "It does." They drove to the fairgrounds in a loose convoy. Vince up front, Decker and Eleanor and Emily in the truck. The others spread out behind on the bikes, engines loud in the cold January morning, vapor trailing from exhausts in the 28-degree air. Emily sat in the truck between Eleanor and Decker with the engine block in a padded case on her lap and watched the road through the windshield with the steady, forward attention of someone who knows where they're going. The winter exhibition was smaller than the November fair. Fewer rides, fewer vendors, the emphasis on handmade and restored and rebuilt. The things people made in their garages and workshops during the months when the ground was frozen and the work was interior. The mechanical arts section occupied 2 long tables near the back of the main hall, and Emily set the engine block at the center of one of them with the care she gave to anything that mattered, and then she stood beside it and waited. People came. They always came to the things that were genuinely made. You could feel the difference between something built and something bought, and most people recognized it even if they couldn't say why. They stopped at the engine block and looked at it and asked her questions, and she answered them in the quiet, direct way she had, without performance, in the voice that was hers. She was answering a question from an older man with grease still on his hands, from his own project when Vince stepped back to give her the room. He stood about 10 feet away with his coffee, and he watched her. Eleanor appeared beside him. She had her own coffee, and she stood the way he was standing, at the right distance, present without pressing. They watched Emily explain the timing mechanism to the man with grease on his hands, watched her use her pencil to sketch something on a paper napkin to illustrate a point, watched the man's expression shift from polite curiosity to genuine interest, to the particular look of one person recognizing another person's fluency in a language they both speak. "She's going to be okay," Eleanor said quietly. "Yeah," Vince said. "She is." "It's going to take time," Eleanor said. "The full memory, the grief. There are going to be days that are bad. I know. But she's—" Eleanor stopped, started again. "She has more of herself back than I expected. After what happened, she has more of herself than I was afraid she might." Vince looked at the engine block on the table, at the chrome that Emily had polished until it caught the overhead lights and threw them back brighter than they came. "She fixed everything we gave her," he said. "That's just who she is." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Not the first night thank you, not the phone call thank you. This one had more in it, more length, more of what had happened between October and January and all the days inside them." He looked at her. "You would have found her," he said. "You were already looking." I didn't know I was looking, she said. I just knew it had been too quiet for too long. He understood that. The specific alarm of too much quiet when the people you're used to hearing from have gone silent. The way silence accumulates into a presence of its own. Bring her to visit, he said, after you're settled. When things are normal. Whenever she wants. Eleanor looked at him. Her eyes had the quality of someone who has come to understand that the word family is larger than the definition she started with and has been making peace with the expansion. We will, she said. Across the table, Emily looked up from her napkin sketch and found Vince through the crowd with the easy accuracy of someone who always knows where the people she trusts are standing. She held up the napkin, raised her eyebrows. He gave her a thumbs up. She turned back to the man with the grease-stained hands. The goodbye happened on a Sunday morning in late January, gray sky, cold that was earnest but not cruel. Eleanor's car was packed. Emily's room was empty, except for the bookshelf, which had stayed because Eleanor had said, practically without sentiment, that a bookshelf was a thing to acquire in one's permanent home, not to transport from a furnished room. Vince had put the faded rabbit book in Emily's bag the night before, when she was asleep. The clubhouse did the thing that groups of people do when something is ending that matters. It gathered without being called. Oz was there. Griff, Leon, Remy, who had driven back from a trip he'd taken to visit a cousin just to be there for this morning, and who was managing himself with the tight, careful composure of someone who has decided to be solid for a specific number of hours and will deal with the rest later. Decker had made breakfast. Real breakfast. The kind that takes an hour and fills a table and requires everyone to sit down together, which they did, all of them, including Eleanor, including Emily, for the last ordinary morning. Nobody made speeches. This was understood. They ate. They talked about the engine block, about what Oz planned to do with the rest of the build, about the route Eleanor planned to take home, about a loose plan for a visit in the spring when the roads were better. They talked around the edges of the thing that was happening without avoiding it. The way people talk when they're trying to be present instead of performing presence, which is harder and more real. After breakfast, Emily went around the table. She hugged Griff, who returned it with the bear hug economy of a man who is not naturally expressive and was bringing everything he had. She hugged Leon, who held her for a moment longer than expected, and then straightened up and looked at a point on the wall with great focus. She hugged Oz, who said, "Keep fixing things into the top of her head," and she nodded against his shoulder. She stopped in front of Remy. He was holding himself together on a thread that she could clearly see. She put her hand out, palm up. He looked at it, looked at her. Then he put his hand in hers the way she'd done with Vince in the workshop, the grip of someone making sure the ground is there. "I'll come back," she said. He breathed out. "Yeah," he said. "I know." She squeezed his hand once and let go. She came to Vince last. He was standing by the door with his coffee, the way he always stood in the morning, and she looked up at him with those eyes that had been hollow at a guardrail in October and were something completely different now, still deep, still serious, but alive in them. Present. Hers. She reached into her coat pocket. She held out the small bedside clock, the one she'd given him the night of the trouble, the one that still wasn't running, the one he'd promised. He looked at it. "You said you'd fix it," she said. He took it from her hand, turned it over. The caseback was plain, no engraving, but it was the weight of it in his palm, the specific small gravity of something unfinished and trusted to him that mattered. "I will," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, all of it in that look. October and the rain and the workshop and the jukebox and the warm milk at 2 a.m, and his name said for the first time in the amber light. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and he held on for as long as she needed, which was long enough that his jaw was doing something he was not going to examine closely in front of anyone. When she stepped back, she looked at his face. "You're going to finish the bike," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We are. I want to see it when it runs." "You'll be the first call I make." She nodded, pulled her coat straight, picked up her bag from beside the door. She walked to Eleanor's car and got in, and Eleanor started the engine and the car moved through the gravel lot and out onto the road, and Vince stood in the doorway of the Iron Compass clubhouse and watched it go, the small clock in his hand, until the road curved and the car was gone. The lot was quiet. The bikes sat in a row in the cold morning, chrome dull under the gray sky, engines still. The juniper moved in the wind at the lot's edge. Somewhere far off, a highway sound, a truck moving north, diminishing. Remy came and stood beside him, then Griff, then Leon, then Oz. Decker last, drying his hands on a kitchen towel, standing in the doorway behind all of them. Nobody said anything. The road was empty in both directions. Vince looked down at the clock in his hand. Small. Cold from the morning air. Stopped. Still here. Still trying. He closed his fingers around it. "All right," he said. His voice was even, steady. The voice of a man who has been broken and rebuilt enough times to know the difference between an ending and a pause. "Let's go finish that bike." He turned. They followed him inside. The door closed. The juniper moved. The road held the silence of a January morning in a small town where nothing was happening and everything had already happened. And the sky above it was the particular shade of gray that comes just before it decides to be something else. Not quite changed yet, still becoming, balanced on the edge of what it was about to be. In the workshop, the 1948 engine block sat on the table where Emily had left it, chrome still bright, every component in its right relationship to every other, the whole mechanism ready, waiting for the rest of itself, waiting to run,